The Viking Seeress Awakens. Hey guys, tonight let's drift back, way back, to a cold, misty Scandinavia. Imagine the wind whistling through pine forests and over fjords, and the smell of smoke from a distant hearth lingering in the air. That's where we'll start. Not with roaring battles or treasure-laden ships, though those do exist, but with something a little more subtle, something a little more, well, mystical. We're talking about the Viking Seeress. Yes, the völva, or the prophetess of Norse society. She wasn't just any old woman with a knack for gossip. No, she was feared, respected, sometimes ignored at her peril, and always slightly enigmatic. If you've ever imagined Viking culture as only axes, horns of mead, and longboats crashing into enemy shores, think again. The seeress operated in shadows, in the quiet corners of halls, and occasionally in the silent forests where the gods might be listening. The first thing to know about these women, or men, though mostly women, was that their job was serious business. They were diviners, fortune tellers, shamans, if you want a more modern word. But don't picture a crystal ball and flowing robes in your usual sense. The Viking seeress worked with the runes, chanting incantations, interpreting visions, and, most importantly, guiding kings, jarls, and warriors toward decisions that could make or break entire clans. Because why not double down on a bit of mystical advice before going into battle? Now, we can start with the sheer presence of a völva. Imagine her walking into a mead hall. The chatter dims because she's not the type to introduce herself with a smile. She enters with a slow, deliberate gait, perhaps carrying a staff carved with mysterious symbols. Her robes are likely worn and layered, each piece steeped in personal significance. And she's old enough to know the weight of history, but young enough not to be ignored entirely. The Norse respected longevity. In that society, a long life usually equaled accumulated wisdom, though in her case, perhaps also a touch of terrifying intuition. And here's something that's always fun. These seeresses were often described in texts as both charming and intimidating. They could bless a marriage, curse a rival, or predict a king's death with equal calmness. In sagas, you'll find them giving advice that sounds a little like, yes, your army might win, but also probably not. Or, more gently, your child will be remarkable, but will not have a long life. Subtle, poetic, slightly depressing, perfect bedtime storytelling material, really. The most famous of these prophetic figures might be one called Thorbjorg Littlevölva, who appears in several Icelandic sagas. Thorbjorg's story is one of careful observation, ritualistic precision, and that slightly unsettling aura that comes from being able to peer into the future, or at least make others believe you can. She would often travel from farmstead to farmstead, invited into homes with feasts laid out in her honor. The hosts knew they were in the presence of someone whose words could change the course of events. Imagine being told over your morning porridge, your husband may survive the winter, or he may not, but the gods will laugh regardless. Charming, right? Thorbjorg and her fellow seeresses performed their craft using multiple tools. Runes were common, etched stones, sticks, or wooden objects, each marked with symbols representing concepts, deities, or natural forces. She would cast these runes, interpret the patterns, and often speak in riddles. This is important. The ambiguity was intentional. Life was messy, even for kings, and a völva's counsel could never be absolute. It had to leave room for human choice, or at least human anxiety. Let's float over to another aspect, their personal lives. Surprisingly, little is known, because sagas usually describe their abilities, not their morning routines. But we can infer some things. Seeresses likely lived semi-nomadic lives, moving among communities, sometimes for years. They were often older women, which might suggest a society where women who outlived their childbearing years could still wield significant influence. Somewhat radical, if you think about it. And they didn't just offer mystical guidance. They were storytellers, historians, and keepers of oral traditions. The sagas credit them with holding collective memory, ensuring that heroic deeds and cautionary tales survived the Scandinavian fog. And, yes, there's always the family aspect. Some völvas were born into their roles. Perhaps a mother taught her daughter the sacred chants, or a grandmother passed down the old knowledge of herbs and omens. Others may have apprenticed or chosen the path later in life, drawn by a calling no one else could quite explain. And in a society that could be brutal toward the elderly or infirm, being a seeress was a form of protection. People might respect you or fear you, but they rarely ignored you. And here's a classic irony. Despite their fearsome reputation, many seeresses were also physically frail. That's right, you'd imagine a Viking prophetess as strong as a longship mast. But the text suggests they were often older, sometimes sickly, and occasionally eccentric. Perhaps they sat quietly in a corner for hours, muttering spells, shaking their staff, or staring into a bowl of water. Yet the wisdom they carried was considered potent enough to outweigh any physical limitations. It's like saying, "Don't mind the cane, she predicts the end of kings." But let's get back to the sagas, because they give us a taste of the everyday drama of prophecy. A recurring motif is the völva appearing at crucial life junctures, a king debating a raid, a family considering an alliance, a community deciding whether to endure a harsh winter or migrate. And the advice was rarely straightforward. The path is dangerous, but not without reward, is the kind of thing they might say, which is mildly unhelpful, if you like clarity, but perfect for keeping everyone on edge and making the völva seem mystical. Interestingly, Norse mythology itself provides a backdrop to the völva's work. The seeress doesn't just operate in isolation. She's connected to the gods, particularly Odin, who himself was fond of wisdom and foresight. In fact, some sagas suggest that Odin taught humans the secret of runes, which the völvas then wielded. This created a hierarchy where seeresses weren't mere entertainers. They were conduits of divine knowledge, walking a fine line between human and sacred realms. And now a subtle note about storytelling style. You'll notice that the sagas rarely describe prophecies as fixed. They were fluid, open to interpretation, and often framed in poetic language. This is crucial. It's not like a modern fortune teller giving you a 50-50 lottery prediction. It was more like, yes, the threads of fate are tangled. Pull one, and others move too. Sleepy, gentle, and slightly ominous. Just the right vibe to lull anyone into thinking, maybe fate is real, or maybe it's just storycraft. By now you might be wondering, did these seeresses ever get it wrong? Of course. Human interpretation is fallible, even under divine inspiration. Sometimes a prophecy would go horribly awry. A king might ignore a warning, march into disaster, and the völva's reputation would either survive in legend or she'd quietly move on to another hall, muttering, "Well, they asked for it." History is cruel, but in a calm, almost indifferent Scandinavian sort of way. And so the Viking seeress sits at the intersection of myth, history, and the daily lives of Norse people. She is part wise woman, part storyteller, part mystic, and part enigma. Her prophecies shaped decisions, influenced battles, and sometimes simply reminded everyone of the relentless, foggy uncertainty of life. Tonight, we've barely skimmed the surface. In the next part, we'll meet a seeress who almost literally shaped the fate of kings, whose words, whispered in quiet halls, could alter the course of entire dynasties. And perhaps we'll explore some of the ritual,
the chants, and the eerie yet gentle methods they used to peer into the future. Because if there's one thing history teaches, it's that even the cold, rugged Vikings sometimes paused to listen to women who could talk to the unseen. So settle in, dim the lights, breathe slowly, and let the subtle hum of Norse prophecy carry you over fjords and forests, through smoky halls, and into the quiet power of a Viking seeress's world.
Prophecies and the fates of kings. All right, guys, let's continue our slow, gentle journey into the quiet power of the Viking seeress. Last time, we set the stage. Misty fjords, smoky halls, and women whose words could shift the threads of fate. Tonight, we move closer, into the very heart of prophecy, where kingdoms teetered on the edge of a cryptic sentence or a carefully cast rune. One of the most famous sagas that mentions a völva is the saga of Eric the Red. Now, Eric is often remembered for his adventures in Greenland, but like many Norse heroes, he was also slightly anxious. This is where the seeress comes in. Her name isn't always recorded, which is convenient if you like a bit of mystery. She arrived in Eric's hall, staff in hand, eyes glinting with the subtle knowledge of things yet to happen. And the saga describes her as speaking slowly, carefully, as though each word might bend reality ever so slightly. "Eric," she said, or the saga says she said, which is basically the same thing, "you will sail west, and the land will be cold, and some will thrive, others will not." Charming, clear as mud, but it was enough. Eric took it seriously, which in retrospect probably saved some lives, or at least some egos. Vikings were not known for their patience, but they were surprisingly attentive to someone who could speak about the future without flinching. This brings us to an important point about völvas. Their words were performative, yes, but also deeply political. A well-timed prophecy could elevate a king's status or undermine him entirely. Imagine a chieftain sitting in his hall, mead in hand, and a völva saying, "You will gain victory if you follow your father's sword, but perhaps not if you follow your own pride." It's gentle, cryptic, and faintly terrifying. The chieftain leaves feeling both informed and uncertain, exactly as intended. Now, let's float over to another famous figure, Harald Fairhair. Harald is often credited as the first king to unite Norway, a task that sounds heroic until you remember it involved decades of conflict and general Viking-style stubbornness. Enter the seeress. According to later sagas, she advised Harald with patience and just enough ambiguity to keep him slightly paranoid. "Your crown may sit lightly," she said, or words like it, "or it may crush you entirely. Watch your enemies and trust the winds." Vikings liked wind metaphors. They liked omens, and Harald, of course, took it seriously. Perhaps a little too seriously, because the saga mentions him consulting multiple seeresses at different times. He was, in other words, anxious, which is a very relatable Viking problem, if you ask me. These consultations weren't just about warfare. Marriage alliances, farm disputes, and even the fate of newborn children often fell under the seeress's purview. She would predict who might survive, who might inherit, and who might be best left ignored. And here's the kicker. People generally obeyed her advice. This wasn't optional. Ignore her at your peril, and history shows you might live to regret it, though probably in a calm, cold fjord kind of way. A fascinating aspect of these prophetic rituals was the use of trance states. Völvas often entered a semi-conscious state, rocking back and forth, chanting or staring into water or reflective surfaces. This wasn't just theatrics. It created an atmosphere of mystery, of otherworldly insight, and encouraged listeners to take the prophecies seriously. From our modern perspective, it might look like meditation or mild eccentricity, but in a Viking hall, it was authority. One seeress who stands out in the texts is Heid, described in the saga of Heid the Seeress. Her tale is a perfect blend of prophecy and subtle menace. Heid traveled across the lands, consulted kings, and performed elaborate divinations. The saga emphasizes her knowledge of future events and her ability to interpret omens in the natural world, the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the cries of newborns. She was observant, patient, and precise, and, crucially, slightly unnerving, which again was the point. Heid's influence demonstrates another key feature of Völvans. They often acted as intermediaries between human ambition and the whims of the gods. Norse mythology wasn't just stories, it was a framework for understanding the unpredictable forces that shaped everyday life. If a völva predicted disaster, people listened, not because they necessarily believed in absolute determinism, but because even the vaguest hint of divine displeasure could change behavior. Avoiding wrath was practical, if nothing else. Now, let's explore one of my favorite narrative motifs: prophecy as irony. Often the words of the seeress were technically accurate, but their interpretation was up to the listener. For example, she might predict a great leader will fall in battle, and the king, naturally, assumes it refers to his rival. Spoiler, sometimes it refers to himself, or someone he underestimated. This subtle, gentle cruelty made her words memorable, and it reinforced the notion that fate, like life, was both inevitable and strangely capricious. And then there's the ritualistic side of prophecy, which is both beautiful and sleepy-inducing in its meticulousness. Völvas often prepared for days, collecting herbs, carving runes, and performing small symbolic acts. They might burn incense or sprinkle water, chanting in a low monotone. Each movement, each word had layers of meaning, though the casual listener might miss them entirely. It's like a slow, deliberate ballet, except instead of music, there's murmured verse and the soft crackle of a hearth fire. Interestingly, the sagas sometimes hint at rivalries among seeresses themselves. Multiple völvas might be consulted for the same event, and their prophecies could contradict one another. Imagine being a Viking chieftain hearing, "Victory is certain," from one, and "The gods laugh at your plans," from another. Which do you follow? In many cases, the one with the more theatrical entrance or the eerier stare won the day. Subtle intimidation was part of the craft. And while we're on the topic of intimidation, let's not forget the occasional curse. Some völvas were not above a little gentle menace. A whispered warning of bad luck, or an ill-fated marriage, or a poorly timed journey could be delivered with such calm certainty that listeners took it as law. Again, subtlety is key. She wasn't screaming in your face, she was leaning in, almost casually, like the mist itself might carry her words away if ignored. But there's also humor here, if you squint. Despite their mystical aura, these women often had to deal with human stubbornness, ego, and occasionally complete nonsense. Imagine a king demanding a prophecy about whether he should wear a blue cloak instead of red. or a farmer asking if his goat will survive the winter. The sagas don't always record their reactions, but you can bet the seeress had a perfectly calm, slightly exasperated response ready. So, as we float through the world of Viking seeresses, what emerges is a picture of women who were simultaneously wise, performative, and mildly terrifying. They shaped decisions, influenced the fates of kings, and left traces in sagas that continued to capture our imagination. Their words, carefully chosen and gently enigmatic, remind us that history isn't just battles and borders, it's also rituals, omens, and the quiet power of those who see what others cannot, or at least appear to. Tonight, we've barely begun. In the next part, we'll explore some of the most dramatic prophecies attributed to völvas, the outcomes that were slightly tragic, slightly ironic, and entirely human. Because if there's one thing Viking history teaches us, it's that even the strongest warriors sometimes paused to hear what a woman whispering in the corner had to say.
Legendary prophecies and quiet irony. All right, settle in. Tonight we move from generalities into stories, real Viking legends where the seeress's words shaped lives, kingdoms, and sometimes just gave everyone a lingering sense of existential unease. Because if there's one thing Vikings loved, it was a little cosmic uncertainty with their mead. Let's start with a story from the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar, as you might remember, is often remembered for his dramatic raids and multiple marriages, but behind the scenes, he occasionally consulted a seeress. One day, a völva entered his hall, sitting on a low stool and quietly observing the men sprawled around. She didn't shout or brandish a sword. She simply looked at Ragnar, and the saga says she saw through him as if he were a thin mist. Delightful imagery. Her prophecy was calm, deliberate, and slightly inconvenient. You will sail east, and fortune will smile, but the price will be heavy. Now Ragnar, being Ragnar, probably assumed this meant gold and glory. Spoiler alert, it also meant the loss of friends, livestock, and a few personal comforts. The point is subtle. The völva's words were accurate, but layered. In her calm monotone, she communicated consequences, irony, and the inevitable intertwining of fate and choice, all at once. Another story involves the seeress völva Heid. We met her briefly last time. Heid's fame rests in part in her ability to predict not just battles, but personal destinies, down to quirks of temperament and mannerism. She once advised a jarl considering marriage alliances. Take the daughter with golden hair, but beware her stubborn heart. It will bring both joy and headache. The jarl, naturally, paid careful attention to the joy part and mostly ignored the headache part. And yet, as often happens in sagas, the headache arrived in full measure, just as predicted. Here's a recurring theme you'll notice in all these stories. The prophecy is never just about events. It's about character, temperament, and the subtle interplay of human choice with divine whim. The völva isn't just telling you what will happen. She's showing you who you are, gently, like a soft hand on the shoulder, except the shoulder is on fire, metaphorically speaking, calmly unsettling. Now, we can't discuss Viking prophecy without mentioning omens in nature. Birds, clouds, the direction of the wind, and even the sound of waves could carry meaning. A völva would watch these signs carefully. She might note that a raven perched near the hall's entrance was favorable, or that the smoke from the hearth was curling oddly, signaling caution. And yes, sometimes the Vikings probably made a lot of decisions based on slightly coincidental natural occurrences. But to them, it was serious, mystical observation, subtle, slow, and absolutely captivating in its quiet authority. Let's look at a specific example. King Harald Bluetooth. He, of course, united Denmark. One saga mentions a seeress predicting a key alliance, saying, "Your neighbor will offer friendship, but not as you imagine. Watch the smoke and tides." Harald, being slightly literal, watched the smoke, interpreted it generously, and ended up in a political negotiation that worked, but not exactly in the way he expected. The prophecy was fulfilled, just softly ironic, a classic völva touch. And sometimes the sagas describe the seeress actively guiding decisions that might seem trivial to us, but were monumental in Viking terms. For instance, choosing the day to sail on a raid could be influenced by her interpretation of omens. A misread day might mean storms, shipwreck, or a lack of favorable wind. Vikings took this seriously because even a minor misstep at sea could be fatal. And the völva, always calm, always detached, would quietly suggest the better day. And it worked, often enough that ignoring her advice was considered unwise, if nothing else, practical. We also see moments of subtle humor in the sagas. Sometimes the king or warrior would misinterpret the prophecy completely. A völva might say, "You will meet a challenge at the fjord," and the listener, naturally dramatic, assumes it's a giant enemy army. Instead, it might be a minor flood or a particularly stubborn goat blocking the road. The sagas rarely emphasize embarrassment, but reading them today, we get the gentle comedic effect. Calm, ironic humor, just the sort that lulls the listener into reflective thought. Now let's talk about rituals again, because the sagas delight in their quiet monotony. Völvas often prepared meticulously before giving prophecy, rubbing oils, chanting low repetitive verses, and sometimes sleeping in ritual spaces. These actions created an aura of authority. The rhythmic chanting, the careful gestures, and the slow, deliberate speech all contributed to a sense of timelessness. You could almost hear the mead hall growing quieter as the völva spoke, the clatter of mugs and footsteps fading into a gentle hum. An interesting note, some sagas hint at rivalries, not just among kings, but among seeresses. Two völvas might offer contrasting visions for the same event. One predicts victory, one predicts caution. The listener, usually a king or chieftain, had to choose whom to follow, and often the one with the more compelling presentation won. Perhaps she rocked more dramatically, or her voice carried a slightly more ethereal tone. Subtle showmanship was part of prophecy, calm showmanship, sleep-inducing if you're paying attention slowly. And finally, we can't forget the gentle tragedy inherent in many prophecies. Even when accurate, the outcomes were often bittersweet. A warrior might gain victory, but lose a brother. A king might inherit a kingdom, but also inevitable rebellion. The völva's words rarely provide comfort. They offer clarity in a calm, measured way. They acknowledge the inevitability of consequence and the unpredictability of life, but do so softly, like a slow breeze through the trees. So, in sum, what emerges is a picture of the Viking seeress as a figure of quiet authority, gentle irony, and subtle influence. She is a woman, or occasionally a man, who can see threads of fate and present them with soft, precise inevitability. Kings, warriors, and common folk all listened, sometimes nervously, sometimes reluctantly, but always with respect. And in doing so, they allowed her insight, real or performative, to shape the course of Viking history in small, deliberate, and sometimes ironic ways. Tonight, as we let our thoughts drift through fjords and mead halls, consider this. The völva's world was not about grand drama or explosive action. It was about subtle influence, careful observation, and the quiet power of suggestion. It's the kind of power that lingers after the saga ends, the kind that shapes choices and lives without a sword in sight. And perhaps as you close your eyes tonight, you can imagine the soft rocking of a völva, murmuring her prophecy, while the world outside, foggy, cold, and slow, listens patiently.
Rituals, runes, and the gentle power of prophecy. All right, let's continue drifting, slow and steady, through the foggy world of Viking prophecy. So far, we've met seeresses, glimpsed their influence over kings, and peeked at the ironic, sometimes bittersweet outcomes of their predictions. Now, let's linger on their methods, those subtle, repetitive, sleep-inducing rituals that lent them both authority and mystique. First, the runes. If you've ever seen the neat rows of angular symbols carved into stones or sticks, congratulations, you've seen the tools of a Viking prophetess. Runes weren't just decorative, they were a language, a sacred script, and a medium for divination. A völva might carry a pouch of carved runes, each symbol representing a concept, a god, or an element of fate. When cast on a table or the floor, the patterns suggested outcomes, paths, or warnings. And yes, interpretation required calm concentration, often hours of quiet thought, rocking back and forth, murmuring the rune's name softly under her breath, sleepy but profound. Next, the chanting. We've touched on it before, but it's worth pausing. A völva's chant was slow, low, repetitive, and designed to focus both her mind and that of the listeners. It's not the kind of chanting you hear in epic movies, no dramatic crescendos, no booming drums. Imagine instead a monotone, rhythmic hum that fills a smoky hall, blending with the flicker of torchlight and the subtle scent of herbs. Over time, the listeners might start to forget their own anxieties, succumbing to the calm authority of her voice. It's mesmerizing in a sleepy, almost hypnotic way. Speaking of herbs, yes, herbs were involved too. Not in the sense of potions or spells, as Hollywood would suggest, but as a component of ritual. Certain plants might be burned, scattered, or brewed into teas to aid focus or create a subtle sensory environment. Dill, juniper, and other local flora were likely common. The völva's familiarity with nature wasn't just symbolic, it reinforced her connection to the rhythms of the world, from tides to seasons to the migration of birds. Subtle, calm, and entirely practical in a Scandinavian sort of way. Let's float gently to the most famous ritual, the Seed. This was a form of magic practiced by some seeresses. The sagas describe it as slow, deliberate, and involving a combination of chanting, symbolic gestures, and occasionally trance states. The goal wasn't flashy spectacle, it was insight, manipulation of probabilities, and gentle influence over the future. The völva would often sit cross-legged, eyes half closed, murmuring, sometimes rocking. The performance itself, quiet and ritualistic, reinforced her authority. Imagine a long hall of warriors and nobles listening, almost hypnotized, while the völva murmurs her predictions. Softly terrifying, but in a slow, calming way.
Now, a slightly ironic point. Despite this aura of supernatural insight, some völvas were known for practical advice. They might predict the outcome of a battle, yes, but also advise on mundane matters. Don't sail today, the wind is contrary, or store extra grain before winter. Their wisdom combined mystical authority with common sense observation, which is comforting in a subtly sleepy way. And here's another charming detail. Many sagas describe the völva as slightly eccentric, even physically frail, yet commanding. They might be older women with a lifetime of observation etched into their faces, sometimes hunched, often rocking, but their presence carried weight. Imagine a small, wizened figure whose every word seems to carry the weight of the cosmos, but might need a stool to reach the table. A calm, gentle paradox, like mist over a fjord. Now on to specific prophecies that shaped Viking campaigns. One saga mentions a seeress predicting the success of a raiding party by observing a single bird in flight. The bird's path, she declared, mirrored the tides of fortune. The warriors, naturally, waited for her signal before boarding their longships, and they prospered, though perhaps just as much due to timing and luck than anything mystical. Still, the völva's words gave them confidence, which is often half the battle. Calm, understated influence. It's effective in subtle ways. Another example involves a king deciding on a marriage alliance. The völva observed the stars, read the runes, and spoke softly. This union will bring strength, but also lingering disputes. The king, intrigued by her calm tone, proceeded anyway, and indeed, both prophecy and reality played out precisely as she suggested. Subtlety and understatement were her trademarks, not dramatic explosions or loud curses, just quiet, precise insight. Interestingly, some sagas hint at rivalries among seeresses. Two völvas might offer conflicting prophecies about the same event. Who wins? Usually the one whose voice carried a more hypnotic cadence, whose gestures seemed more deliberate, or whose presence simply inspired awe. In other words, subtle theatrics were part of the craft. Sleepy, measured theatrics, but theatrics nonetheless. And finally, consider the long-term influence. A völva's words could shape not just a single campaign or marriage, but entire dynasties. Her calm guidance might prevent rash decisions, encourage careful planning, or subtly manipulate outcomes. She worked in whispers, in half glances, in runes cast across the floor. The effect was profound precisely because it was quiet. No grand speeches, no fanfare, just slow, gentle authority guiding choices in a world of uncertainty. So tonight, as we drift further into the Viking world, imagine a smoky hall, firelight flickering across carved wood, warriors murmuring in anticipation, and a völva sitting quietly, staff in hand, chanting softly. Her words, carefully chosen, could shift kingdoms, and yet she remained calm, detached, and entirely composed, like the slow turning of seasons or the quiet lapping of waves against a fjord. The völva's world is not one of dramatic action, but of quiet influence, subtle guidance, and patient observation. And perhaps as you close your eyes tonight, you can hear her soft chant, imagine the gentle rocking of her body, and let her calm, measured voice carry you through the misty fjords of Viking Scandinavia.
Outcomes, irony, and the lingering influence of the völva. All right, friends, let's continue our slow glide through Viking history, focusing tonight on the outcomes of prophecy, those quiet, often ironic results that the völvas seem to predict with calm precision. Because, as you may have noticed, much of Viking saga storytelling thrives on subtle irony rather than loud drama. Consider the saga of King Olaf Tragfason. Olaf, known for his Christianizing campaigns and rather intense personality, once consulted a seeress before embarking on a risky venture. The prophecy was calm, understated, and slightly cryptic. The path will be bright, yet shadows will linger. Olaf, being Olaf, probably interpreted this optimistically. He liked light and presumably hoped shadows could be ignored. But of course, the saga tells us the venture succeeded partially, yet encountered unexpected resistance, losses, and diplomatic headaches. In other words, the prophecy was accurate, just not in the way Olaf preferred. Subtle, quiet irony. And this pattern repeats throughout Viking history. The völva's words rarely guarantee comfort. They merely reflect probabilities, human tendencies, and divine whims. A warrior might receive a prediction of victory and charge confidently into battle, only to find his companions slain or a miscommunication undermining the plan. The prophecy doesn't fail. It simply reveals complexity in a calm, measured tone. One of the most striking features of völva prophecy is its focus on timing. Several sagas mention a seeress advising a king to delay a raid by a day or two, citing unfavorable winds, animal omens, or patterns of the stars. The delay might seem trivial, yet it could prevent disaster, ensure better weather, or allow reinforcements to arrive. Vikings were pragmatic people, despite the romanticized notion of reckless marauding. Listening to a völva's advice was often the difference between a minor setback and catastrophic failure. And she delivered it softly, without fanfare, which is exactly the sort of sleep-inducing narrative tone we are cultivating tonight. Now let's discuss marriages, alliances, and dynastic consequences. A subtle but recurring theme in saga literature is that völvas often predicted the emotional, not just political, outcomes of unions. One völva warned a chieftain, "This bride will bring joy, but also stubbornness that your house will feel for generations." The chieftain ignored the warning, or focused only on the joy, and the saga notes subsequent domestic disputes, long-standing feuds, and minor rebellions. The prophecy was fulfilled, not violently or dramatically, but in a slow, lingering, and slightly ironic manner. And speaking of irony, consider the story of a seeress predicting the rise of a rival. The prophecy might say, "He will sit upon the throne, but not as you imagine." The listener, naturally, interprets it as a distant, irrelevant rival. Yet decades later, the irrelevant rival ascends, quietly, subtly, and with exactly the complications predicted. The völva's calm authority extends across time, her influence surviving in whispers and decisions long after the mead hall is empty. Another interesting motif is the dual nature of prophecy, the blend of warning and reassurance. A völva might speak of loss and hardship, but also of opportunity and growth. This duality is gentle, not dramatic. It's like a soft nudge rather than a scream. The sagas often described kings and warriors pausing, considering, and sometimes altering plans in response. The world of Viking prophecy then is not binary, success or failure. It's a landscape of nuance, subtle shifts, and careful observation. And let's not overlook the social function. A völva's presence reinforced hierarchy and encouraged cautious governance. Her soft authority kept kings in check, prompted nobles to negotiate carefully, and reminded ordinary people of the divine and mystical dimensions of everyday life. This influence was powerful precisely because it was quiet. No swords were drawn, no armies mobilized on her command alone. Her tool was calm perception, ritual, and slightly unnerving insight. Now, a small digression into literary style. The sagas often exaggerate, but always in a measured, hypnotic way. The völva's words are usually calm, poetic, and repetitive, creating a rhythm that feels inevitable. Listeners, both in the story and reading centuries later, absorb the cadence as much as the content. This creates the sleepless historian effect in saga form: subtle, slow, mesmerizing, and slightly unsettling, just the right tone for tonight's journey. Some prophecies even span generations. A völva might predict outcomes affecting grandchildren of the original listener long after her voice has gone silent. Sagas hint at the enduring impact, decisions guided, avoided mistakes, small adjustments in behavior, all quietly altering the course of history. The legacy of prophecy, therefore, is less about dramatic spectacle and more about measured influence over time, a calming, slow burn effect that resonates across decades. And finally, let's touch on the death of the völva herself. Sagas rarely dramatize it. Often she departs quietly, leaving behind a trail of influence and memories of her calm authority. Her staff, her runes, and her chants continue in stories, repeated by those who remember or choose to remember her guidance. The influence persists not through spectacle, but through habit, tradition, and subtle ripple effects across time. Sleepy, enduring, quietly powerful. So tonight, as you imagine the Viking world, consider this: battles may rage, kingdoms may rise and fall, but a calm, quietly persuasive woman, murmuring over runes and soft chants, could alter the course of events just as effectively as any sword. Her prophecies linger, subtle and ironic, influencing choices, shaping alliances, and embedding themselves in the quiet architecture of Norse history. As you drift through these images, fjords shrouded in mist, halls flickering with torchlight, a calm völva observing and murmuring, you might sense the profound subtlety of her power. Not flashy, not loud, not dramatic, just measured, patient, and quietly inescapable. And perhaps as you close your eyes tonight, you'll hear the soft rocking of a staff, the gentle hum of a chant, and the echo of a prophecy that quietly shaped an entire civilization.
Myth, fate, and the calm inevitability of the völva. All right, friends. Tonight, we move gently from individual prophecies into the larger interplay between Viking seeresses and Norse mythology itself.
Because to truly understand the völva, we need to see her not just as a predictor of events, but as a mediator between humans and gods. And naturally, we'll keep things slow, quiet, and slightly ironic, just the way the sagas or a sleepy historian would prefer. First, a bit of context. Norse mythology is full of fate. The Norns, three women who weave destiny at the roots of Yggdrasil, are perhaps the most famous. They are relentless, patient, and indifferent, weaving the threads of life for gods and mortals alike. A völva, in a sense, acts as a messenger of this cosmic order. She doesn't change the threads, she observes them, interprets their twists, and relays her insights to humans. Calm, subtle, quietly powerful. One of the most hypnotic aspects of this mythology is its sense of inevitability. Even the gods are subject to fate. Ragnarok, the end of the world, is predetermined. Even if a hero receives warning, the event unfolds inevitably, though the details may vary. The völva's role, therefore, is not to prevent destiny entirely, but to guide the human element within it. Her predictions often reflect nuance, choice, and consequence, gentle ripples in a vast, unstoppable river of fate. Let's consider a specific saga example, the saga of the Ynglinga. In this story, a völva predicts the downfall of a king, speaking softly and rhythmically, almost like a lullaby that masks the grimness beneath. "He will rise high, yet the ground will shift beneath him," she murmurs. The king interprets it optimistically, as is human nature, and yet the prophecy unfolds exactly as she indicated, though in a series of small, seemingly mundane events: betrayals, minor defeats, subtle political shifts. Calmly inevitable, gently ironic, entirely Norse. And here's something slightly funny, in a quiet, saga-like way. Sometimes humans misinterpret prophecy in absurdly mundane ways. A king might fixate on a metaphorical warning about falling branches and expect literal trees, while the real challenge comes from political scheming or a rebellious Jarl. The völva, of course, remains calm, unmoved, rocking gently, murmuring chants, and allowing the humans to slowly puzzle out the meaning. Sleep-inducing and slightly infuriating from a historical point of view. Another element is ritual and storytelling. Many sagas describe a völva recounting not only predictions, but also mythic tales, genealogies, and the deeds of ancestors. In doing so, she anchors the prophecy in a broader historical and cosmological context. Listeners absorb both myth and guidance, weaving practical decisions with the quiet rhythm of legend. This dual function, storyteller and seer, is central to her influence. Calm, slow, and slightly hypnotic, much like the weathered fjords themselves. We should also mention Odin, who is closely tied to both knowledge and prophecy. Some sagas suggest that Odin himself imparts secrets to völvas, granting insight into the runes, the Norns, or the patterns of fate. This connection underscores the völva's authority. She is not merely a human interpreter, she is a conduit for divine insight. And yet, she delivers this insight without spectacle, without dramatic gestures. Just slow, deliberate words that carry weight precisely because of their understated calm. Now, let's focus on irony, because the sagas love it. A völva might predict that a warrior will triumph in battle, and he does, but the victory comes at unexpected cost. His close companion dies, the spoils are minimal, or the victory sows seeds of future discord. accuracy and inevitability coexist with gentle tragedy. The völva's calm monotone in these moments seems almost wry. Yes, victory came, but not without consequences, as you might have predicted if you had listened carefully. One particularly famous example involves the seeress who advised King Harald Fairhair. She predicted the unification of Norway, speaking quietly and rhythmically, emphasizing patience and subtlety. Harald achieved his goal, but only after decades of careful maneuvering, occasional setbacks, and minor betrayals. Her prophecy did not prevent hardship. It simply reflected the path and allowed for measured human agency. Sleepy, understated, and entirely effective. And there's a pattern in sagas. Prophecy often works as gentle cautionary advice rather than dramatic revelation. The völva rarely shouts, "You will die tomorrow." She whispers, "Be mindful, for the road you tread may shift." It's the difference between panic and reflection, between chaos and slow, deliberate action. This is the subtle power of the völva, influencing decisions while remaining calm, slightly detached, and mesmerizingly authoritative. Finally, the legacy. Even after a völva passes, her influence lingers. Sagas continue to cite her advice, runes carved in memory, chants repeated in story. Kings, jarls, and farmers alike remember her counsel, sometimes generations later. Fate is inevitable, perhaps, but the gentle, thoughtful guidance of the völva ensures that humans navigate it with subtlety and wisdom. Calm, measured, slightly ironic, guidance rippling across time. So tonight, as we continue drifting through misty halls and foggy fjords, imagine a völva seated in quiet ritual, chanting softly, interpreting runes, observing the world. Kings may rise and fall, wars may rage, fate may be indifferent, but her calm, measured insight persists, shaping choices, guiding actions, and embedding itself in the very fabric of Viking history. As you settle further into the quiet rhythm of this story, allow the soft, measured voice of prophecy to carry you gently into reflection. Calm, subtle, slightly ironic, and entirely inevitable, in the gentle way of the Viking seeress.
Everyday influence and the domestic power of the völva. All right, friends, tonight we drift from kings and battles into the quieter spaces of Viking life, homes, farms, and small communities. Because while it's tempting to picture völvas only in grand halls predicting epic events, much of their influence was subtle, domestic, and quietly pervasive. Sleepy, thoughtful, and slightly ironic. Just the right tone for a late-night journey. In many sagas, völvas are depicted visiting villages, consulting ordinary families, and offering guidance on daily matters. They might advise on planting crops, predicting the success of a harvest, or warning of unfavorable weather. Imagine a farmer, boots muddied, peering at the sky, while a calm, slightly mysterious woman murmurs, "Plant the barley tomorrow, not today. The winds are against you." Practical advice wrapped in ritualistic calm. And in a world where a failed harvest could mean famine, this counsel mattered. Her influence extended to domestic harmony as well. A völva might quietly observe a family dispute, listen to grievances, and offer gentle advice. "Patience," she might murmur. "A harsh word now will echo through the hearth for months." It's easy to overlook, but in tight-knit Viking households, her calm, measured words could prevent long-term conflicts. Subtle, slow, and remarkably effective, a form of social magic, if you will. And then there's marriage. As we've mentioned, the völva often weighed in on unions. Beyond dynastic or political marriages, she advised ordinary couples too. A quiet word on temperament compatibility, family dynamics, or timing could prevent a minor disagreement from snowballing into serious conflict. Her predictions weren't loud declarations, they were whispered insights, soft enough to be ignored if one chose, but rarely forgotten. Sleepy, subtle influence at its best. Another subtle aspect of her power was the blessing, or gentle warning associated with childbirth. Some sagas hint that völvas visiting expectant mothers, performing slow, deliberate rituals, chanting softly and offering reassurance. The child will be strong, but wary of shadows. A strange, poetic phrase, perhaps, but interpreted carefully, it could guide family decisions, naming rituals or precautions for health. Calm, ritualized care, a quiet hand shaping life from birth. Even social etiquette could fall under her influence. Imagine a village gathering. The völva arrives, observes interactions, and offers a single comment that subtly shifts behavior. Perhaps a merchant is warned, "Speak slowly and weigh your words," or a young man is nudged toward humility. The hall or gathering place responds to her presence in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Authority doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Interestingly, some sagas suggest that völvas also acted as record keepers of local history. Their memory, long and precise, preserved genealogies, important events, and community wisdom. In a society without widespread literacy, the völva's calm, deliberate narration helped maintain social cohesion, connect generations, and ensure that lessons of the past were gently transmitted to the present. Sleepy storytelling as social glue, a very Viking solution. And yes, subtle irony appears even here. Sometimes a family or leader ignored her calm counsel, thinking, surely this applies only to dramatic matters. Yet the minor inconveniences she predicted, missed harvests, small domestic conflicts, often came to pass. The völva's calm authority worked because she spoke slowly, deliberately, with enough poetic ambiguity that people could interpret it optimistically, until reality reminded them otherwise. Calm irony woven into daily life. We also see a gentle interplay between ritual and observation. The völva might watch the sky, observe animal behavior, or note the rhythm of the seasons, then translate her observations into practical guidance for the community. This blending of natural insight, mythic symbolism, and careful prediction reinforced her authority. The advice felt timeless, the kind that flows slowly through generations, shaping choices with subtle, cumulative effect. Even her absence mattered. Once a völva left a community, her influence lingered in memory, ritual, and story. Families might recall her words, adjust decisions based on prior guidance, or repeat her chants in ceremonial contexts. The ripple of her calm authority extended far beyond her physical presence, quietly guiding human behavior in ways both practical and symbolic. In summary, the völva's domestic influence is a perfect example of subtle power. No grand battles, no dramatic proclamations, just slow observation, gentle guidance, and carefully chosen words. Kings, warriors, and peasants alike were shaped not only by her prophecies about epic events, but also by her quiet, measured presence in daily life. And perhaps this is why the sagas remember her, not for dramatic action, but for the enduring calm of her influence. So tonight, as we drift further into Viking life, imagine a small village, mist curling over the fjords, the soft crackle of hearth fires, and a calm völva sitting quietly, staff in hand, observing, murmuring, and gently shaping the flow of everyday life. No spectacle, no drama, just quiet wisdom, subtle influence, and soft inevitability. Exactly as history remembers her. Campaigns, battles, and the quiet irony of fate. All right, friends, tonight we gently move back to the wider world. Viking raids, campaigns, and the subtle influence of prophecy on decisions that could ripple across kingdoms. As always, we'll keep things calm, slow, and lightly ironic, just enough to notice, not enough to excite. One of the most fascinating aspects of völva influence is her role in pre-battle decisions. The sagas often describe a king or chieftain consulting a seeress before setting out on a campaign. Her calm, measured advice could determine when to set sail, which route to take, or whether to postpone an assault. For instance, a simple warning like, "The wind carries ill news today," might save lives, or at least prevent a small naval disaster. The advice was subtle, practical, and wrapped in ritualized performance. Sleepy, understated influence at its finest. Take Ragnar Lothbrok again. The saga notes that he consulted a völva before one of his eastward raids. Her words were cryptic. "Fortune smiles, but your companions may stumble." Ragnar, naturally, focused on the "fortune smiles" part. The result? Victory, yes, but with casualties and minor missteps, exactly as she predicted. Calm irony, quietly embroidered into history. The völva doesn't celebrate or mourn. She observes, interprets, and lets events unfold. Another saga mentions a lesser-known völva, advising a regional jarl before a land dispute escalated into war. She recommended a subtle, patient approach. Negotiate first, observe the enemy, and wait for signs of internal weakness. The jarl followed her advice, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The saga notes the outcome with gentle approval. Thus, by quiet counsel, a fight was softened before it began. Her power, slow and understated, shaped outcomes without a single dramatic confrontation. Now, let's float to a slightly ironic narrative. In some sagas, a völva predicts that a king will triumph over his rivals, but only if he avoids arrogance. Predictably, the king misinterprets "avoid arrogance" as a minor caution and proceeds with his usual pride. The prophecy unfolds anyway, partially fulfilled, but with consequences for his ego, some minor defeats, or strained alliances. Calmly ironic, almost meditative in its delivery, just the way a saga likes to linger over human foibles. Timing, again, is central. One saga recounts a seeress advising that a fleet departed dawn for the most favorable tides. The leader ignores her, preferring convenience. The ships encounter difficult waters, minor losses occur, and the lesson is recorded, gently, in saga prose. The völva doesn't intervene, she simply observes and murmurs softly. The outcome is a quiet affirmation of her insight. Subtle, slightly sleepy, entirely effective. Interestingly, völvas also advised on post-battle actions. Who should govern newly acquired lands? Which alliances would hold? Which spoils should be distributed to avoid future resentment? Even after the immediate conflict, her calm influence guided long-term political stability. The sagas often note these decisions in passing, almost as a gentle sigh. And so the king followed her counsel, and peace lasted a little longer. Not dramatic, not exciting, just quietly enduring. And here's a pattern worth noting. Many sagas describe the prediction, the human misinterpretation, and the eventual ironic fulfillment. A völva might say, "A long winter will test your patience." The leader imagines cold weather. The saga reports that it was not the cold that caused hardship, but famine, delays in tribute, or minor disputes. The prophecy is accurate, just not in the literal, expected sense. Calm, reflective irony, perfectly suited for bedtime listening. Another example comes from the sagas surrounding Harald Fairhar. A völva predicted his unification of Norway, but noted subtle consequences. The land will be united, yet old feuds will smolder in quiet corners. Harald succeeded, and the prophecy was fulfilled exactly, though not with dramatic clashes on every hill. The sagas emphasize patience, observation, and careful interpretation, quiet, almost meditative lessons in governance. Finally, consider the legacy of these campaigns. Even after the battles, the advice, warnings, and observations of the völva continued to shape behavior. Kings remembered, warriors hesitated thoughtfully, and minor disputes were often resolved quietly. The sagas record these ripples with a calm, reflective tone, emphasizing that influence does not require spectacle. The quiet authority of the völva endures, shaping choices, tempering human impulsiveness, and quietly threading through history like mist through fjords. So tonight, as we drift through Viking campaigns in our minds, picture a calm hall, the flicker of torches casting long shadows, warriors adjusting armor, and a völva seated quietly, staff in hand, murmuring softly, interpreting omens, and influencing choices in subtle, measured ways. No spectacle, no shouting, just soft, enduring authority, slightly ironic outcomes, and quiet inevitability. Völvas in legendary sagas and cultural memory. All right, friends, tonight we float into the quieter, yet enduring side of Viking influence, the role of völvas in shaping legendary sagas, myths, and the collective memory of their culture. Their impact wasn't always immediate or dramatic. Rather, it was slow, subtle, and long-lasting, just like the gentle rise and fall of waves against a fjord. In many sagas, the völva is both a character and a narrator, a witness to events, an interpreter of meaning. She often frames stories of kings, warriors, and gods, blending prophecy with reflection. A subtle, slightly ironic touch runs through these narratives. Even when the prophecy is fulfilled, the sagas remind us that humans tend to misinterpret or forget nuance, creating a quiet tension between fate and free will. Sleepy, thoughtful, and quietly compelling. Take the saga of the Volsungs, for instance. Seeresses appear intermittently, predicting outcomes that intertwine with family feuds, heroic deeds, and tragic flaws. One völva whispers warnings of betrayal, yet the heroes, caught in pride or desire, fail to heed her advice. The saga does not dramatize the moment. It notes it almost like a gentle sigh. He did not listen, and thus the story continued. Calm, reflective irony, the hallmark of prophecy in saga form. Another saga, the Saga of the Inglings, recounts how völvas guide kings through mundane and monumental choices alike. Their insights range from the exact timing of harvests to political maneuvers and minor skirmishes. They are always calm, observing quietly, and rarely intervene with force. Instead, they provide perspective, nudging humans to make choices aligned with fate while allowing the inevitable to unfold. Subtle influence, measured impact, quiet authority. Völvas also played a crucial role in preserving history and genealogy. In a society where oral storytelling was central, their calm, deliberate recitation of events, family lines, and ancestral deeds ensured that memory endured. These details appear in sagas not as dramatic highlights, but as soft, persistent threads. So it was told that this line would face trials, yet endure. Their narrative style creates a hypnotic cadence, gently embedding cultural values, lessons, and prophecies into memory. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, perfect for long evenings by the fire. Interestingly, the sagas often highlight the interplay of myth and observation. A völva might link practical advice to the movements of the stars or patterns in animal behavior, presenting it as guidance from the gods or Norns. Humans, of course, interpreted this in layers. Some saw divine intervention, others practical insight, and some simply poetic warning. The völva's calm authority allowed all interpretations to coexist, quietly shaping understanding over generations. Sleepy, ironic, and enduring. And here's a slightly charming point. Völvas sometimes appear in sagas as eccentric, enigmatic figures. They might rock in place, chant softly, or carry a staff adorned with simple runes. Their physical presence reinforces the hypnotic cadence of their words. Listeners, warriors, kings, and ordinary folk are drawn into their slow, deliberate rhythm, absorbing guidance not through urgency or spectacle, but through quiet attention. Sleep-inducing, yet profoundly effective. Finally, consider their cultural legacy. Even centuries after Viking settlements faded, stories of völvas persisted. Their rituals, chants, and prophecies survived in folklore, influencing how communities remembered the past and interpreted the future. The calm, measured cadence of their storytelling, the subtle irony woven into prophecy, and the quiet moral and practical guidance all endured. Their influence, slow and gentle, rippled across time like fog rolling over fjords, inescapable, quietly persistent, and soothingly inevitable. So tonight, as we drift through these sagas, imagine a völva seated in a smoky hall, murmuring her insights, watching the movements of humans and gods alike. She does not shout, she does not demand. She simply observes, interprets, and gently nudges, leaving behind a legacy of calm wisdom, subtle irony, and quiet authority. And perhaps as you close your eyes tonight, you can hear the soft cadence of her voice echoing through the misty fjords of memory, carrying the wisdom of generations past.
Famous prophecies, quiet irony, and lingering lessons. All right, friends, tonight we linger on some of the more memorable prophecies from Viking sagas, those calm, slightly ironic predictions that subtly shaped events and left enduring lessons. As always, we'll keep things measured, hypnotic, and quietly reflective. Let's start with a story about King Harald Fairhair, whose unification of Norway is well known. According to the sagas, a völva predicted his success in a calm, rhythmic voice. "The land shall bow beneath your rule,
yet not without whispers of old grievances. Harold, naturally ambitious, focused on the grandeur of land shall bow and underestimated the lingering tension in his newly united realm. Over time, minor rebellions, disputes among nobles, and subtle political instability unfolded exactly as predicted. The saga reports it almost as an aside, a quiet sigh, a gentle confirmation of the völva's insight. Sleepy, ironic, entirely effective. Another example involves Ragnar Lothbrok's famed raids in England. One saga notes that a völva cautioned him, "Fortune will favor your ships, but some hearts among your men will falter." Ragnar, true to his adventurous nature, interpreted only the fortune part. The campaign succeeded, yes, but not without losses and moments of hesitation among his companions. The prophecy was accurate, just softly ironic. Victory intertwined with small, predictable setbacks. Calm influence shaping human action, almost imperceptibly. Then there's the story of a minor chieftain whose völva predicted a weather-related setback before a coastal raid. She whispered, "The wind hides a challenge. Wait one sun." The chieftain ignored her advice, preferring immediate action. His fleet encountered stormy seas, delaying the raid and forcing minor losses. The saga records this without drama, just a gentle acknowledgement. Thus, the forecast proved correct. Quiet authority confirmed by experience, subtle, sleep-inducing, and profoundly effective. Völvas also appeared in domestic and dynastic contexts. One saga recounts a prophecy for a bride entering a prominent family. Her joy will shine, yet patience will be tested. The newlyweds focused on joy, and, predictably, minor marital disputes arose, exactly as predicted. The saga doesn't linger on drama. It simply notes the subtle fulfillment of prophecy. Calm, ironic, and instructive. A gentle moral wrapped in poetic phrasing. Timing is another recurring motif. Prophecies often hinge on days, tides, or celestial patterns. A völva might suggest departing for a raid at dawn rather than dusk, planting crops after observing subtle omens, or delaying a council until the wind shifted. These small adjustments, seemingly trivial, could prevent losses or secure success. And in sagas, these moments are rarely dramatized. Instead, they're reported with calm authority. Heeding her advice, the journey was smoother. Quiet impact, gentle rhythm, soft inevitability. Interestingly, sagas also highlight human misinterpretation as a source of subtle irony. A leader might hear, "Shadows will linger," and assume a literal interpretation. Decades later, those shadows manifest in unexpected ways. Political intrigue, delayed alliances, or minor setbacks. The prophecy is fulfilled exactly, but only slowly, subtly, and with quiet inevitability. A hallmark of völva storytelling, patient observation, understated influence, soft irony. One particularly memorable story involves a völva predicting a child's future. She noted the child would be strong of arm and wary of whispers. The parents celebrated the strength and largely ignored the caution. As predicted, the child grew capable in battle, but encountered subtle social challenges that required careful navigation. Calm, measured prophecy, emphasizing nuance over drama. Sleepy, reflective, instructive. And let's not forget the social function. Prophecies shaped alliances, marriages, harvests, and even village etiquette. They encouraged reflection, careful planning, and patience, a soft reminder of cause and effect, human fallibility, and the gentle inevitability of fate. The völva's power rested not in spectacle or coercion, but in quiet, measured guidance, softly steering choices without demanding obedience. And finally, consider the enduring legacy. Even after the völva's physical presence faded, her influence persisted through stories, chants, and memories. Kings and commoners alike continued to reference her words. Communities carried forward her advice, subtly guiding behavior across generations. The sagas preserve this rhythm, prophecy as a slow, measured force shaping history without drama, always quietly compelling. And so tonight, as we drift through Viking sagas, imagine a völva sitting quietly, staff in hand, chanting softly, observing the world. Her words ripple through battles, households, and communities, shaping events with subtle irony and enduring calm. No spectacle, no fanfare, just the hypnotic rhythm of insight, patience, and quiet inevitability. And as you settle further into this narrative, allow the gentle cadence of prophecy to carry you through the misty fjords of memory, softly, gently, inevitably. Psychological influence and the quiet authority of the völva. All right, friends. Tonight we move gently into the inner workings of Viking minds and communities, exploring how völvas exerted influence not through force or spectacle, but through calm authority, quiet suggestion, and psychological presence. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, perfect for our late-night journey. A key aspect of völva power was anticipation. Leaders, warriors, and even ordinary villagers knew that their decisions might be observed and commented upon by a seeress. This awareness created a subtle psychological effect. People began to measure their actions, to pause before impulsive moves, to consider consequences. The völva didn't shout warnings, she murmured them. And yet the mere knowledge of her observation encouraged reflection. Slow, gentle, and profoundly effective. Consider the saga of King Harald Fairhair again. The narrative notes that he often sought the counsel of a völva before major decisions. The subtle psychological impact is clear. Knowing she would observe, interpret, and perhaps judge his plans, encouraged patience and forethought. The völva's authority was less about commanding and more about shaping thought. Calm, pervasive, slightly ironic influence. Even in moments of personal emotion, anger, pride, fear, the presence of a völva could modulate behavior. A warrior frustrated by minor setbacks might hear her quiet chant or remember her cryptic words and pause before acting rashly. A king facing a delicate political choice might recall her steady voice and reconsider hasty decisions. Her influence was psychological, indirect, gentle, and subtle, yet enduring. Sleepy, hypnotic, entirely understated. The sagas also suggest that völvas reinforced social cohesion. By providing wisdom, prophecy, and narrative context, they offered communities a framework for understanding conflict, change, and misfortune. People absorbed this guidance slowly, integrating it into thought and behavior. The völva's calm authority helped maintain order, reduce impulsivity, and encourage deliberation, all without overt force. Quiet power, elegantly applied. And here's the slightly ironic part. Humans often misinterpret, partially heed, or outright ignore advice. Yet the sagas note that even partial attention can align outcomes with the völva's insight. A warrior may disregard one warning, but internalize another, still achieving the balance of caution and action the prophecy suggested. The effect is subtle, indirect, and psychologically compelling. A quiet dance of influence across time. Another subtle function of the völva was emotional regulation. Her calm, measured voice, slow chants, and deliberate movements created a meditative rhythm. Listeners, warriors, kings, villagers absorbed this cadence unconsciously. Anxiety diminished, focus sharpened, and decisions were made with reflective care. The sagas rarely dramatize this. It's reported as gentle observation. He paused and considered, for her words lingered in his mind. Sleep-inducing, reflective, deeply human. Interestingly, the völva's psychological influence extended to storytelling. Her narratives were slow, deliberate, and carefully structured. By recounting past events, genealogies, and mythic examples, she provided context and subtle moral guidance. Listeners absorbed lessons in patience, foresight, and measured action, not through forceful instruction, but through rhythm, repetition, and calm authority. Subtle, reflective, hypnotic. The sagas even hint at long-term psychological effects. Leaders who repeatedly consulted völvas developed habits of deliberation, caution, and foresight. Communities remembered her counsel, shaped traditions around her insights, and internalized patterns of careful observation. Her influence persisted not as loud commands, but as quietly embedded wisdom, sleepy, enduring, pervasive. And let's not overlook irony, always present in saga storytelling. The völva might warn of an impending challenge in calm, measured tones, and the human response often amplifies the outcome. A minor oversight becomes a lesson in patience. A misinterpreted word becomes an enduring moral. Prophecy and psychology intertwine, producing quiet lessons wrapped in gentle irony. Finally, consider the subtle authority of presence. Even when not speaking, the völva commanded attention. Her posture, her slow movements, her staff, her chanting, they communicated confidence, awareness, and insight. People reacted to her calmly, unconsciously adjusting decisions, behaviors, and social interactions. Her power was entirely subtle, psychological, reflective, persistent, sleepy, yet undeniably effective. So, tonight, as we drift further into Viking life, imagine a smoky hall, the quiet murmur of conversation, and a völva seated in still observation. Her voice is calm, her presence measured. Choices are considered more carefully. Decisions unfold with subtle guidance. Her authority is quiet, her influence enduring, her rhythm hypnotic. And perhaps as you drift toward sleep, you can feel the gentle sway of her insight, shaping minds, communities, and history itself.
Legacy, memory, and the echoes of the völva. All right, friends, tonight we float toward the lingering, almost spectral legacy of the völva. Her influence long after Viking settlements faded, her subtle authority preserved in stories, folklore, and cultural memory. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, just the tone for our late-night journey. Even as the Viking Age drew to a close, the memory of völvas persisted. Communities continued to recount their stories, often embellishing ritual, prophecy, and observation in quiet, hypnotic ways. Their words became cultural touchstones, guiding behavior, shaping social norms, and providing context for both mundane and extraordinary events. Subtle authority preserved in narrative rhythm. Consider the ways folklore retains her presence. Tales of seeresses who foretold victories, disasters, or family fortunes circulated long after their physical presence vanished. These stories are rarely dramatic in the cinematic sense. They are quiet, measured, slightly ironic, and focused on the enduring human lessons embedded in prophecy. Sleepy storytelling with reflective depth, a perfect bridge between history and myth. One saga notes a völva who predicted the fate of a noble family centuries in advance. As generations passed, her words were repeated in lullabies, village tales, and ritual recitations. Children learned caution, leaders remembered the weight of choice, and communities subtly adjusted behavior according to her advice. Quiet, persistent influence carried forward without ceremony, without spectacle, but with remarkable endurance. Even in written records, völvas left their mark. When Christian scribes recorded sagas and histories, they often preserved subtle references to seeresses, maintaining their calm narrative voice, gentle irony, and emphasis on measured consequence. Her influence was codified not as dramatic prophecy, but as cultural memory, a slow, reflective guide for readers and listeners alike, sleep-inducing, thoughtful, enduring. Interestingly, völvas also influenced ritual practice long after the Viking Age. Seasonal ceremonies, ancestral observances, and small domestic rituals retained echoes of their chanting, runic guidance, and meditative presence. Communities may have forgotten the original völva, but her methods and philosophy persisted in quiet, daily life, mindfulness, observation, and gentle guidance. Hypnotic, calming, subtle power, enduring across centuries. And of course, the irony persists. Many sagas and folk tales recount völva predictions fulfilled in ways no one expected. A minor misinterpretation, a delayed response, a forgotten phrase, each became part of the legend. The völva's subtle hand shaped not only outcomes, but also the stories themselves, creating layers of quiet humor, reflective irony, and gentle moral guidance. Sleepy, meditative storytelling at its finest. Even scholars centuries later note this hypnotic rhythm. Völvas weren't loud or confrontational. Their influence was soft, persistent, psychological, and social. Through observation, ritual, and story, they quietly shaped individual choices, community behavior, and collective memory.
Their legacy survives in the cadence of sagas, the structure of folk tales, and the reflective, measured tone that still resonates when we read or hear their stories today. Finally, consider the emotional resonance. The völva's calm presence reminds us that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it lingers, sometimes it shapes history in ways so quiet, so subtle, that only reflection reveals its influence. Her chants, her runes, her quiet counsel all endure as a hypnotic echo, gently guiding the rhythm of memory and narrative long after the fjords are empty and the halls dark. So tonight, as we drift to the final reaches of our journey, imagine the soft sway of her staff, the murmured cadence of prophecy, and the gentle imprint she leaves on minds and culture. Calm, ironic, enduring, and hypnotic, the völva's presence is timeless, shaping thought, guiding choices, and threading quietly through the tapestry of history. Sleep well, listening to the soft echoes of her insight, carried through centuries, soft, subtle, and inevitable.
Myth, divine influence, and the slow unfolding of fate. All right, friends, tonight we settle into the quieter, almost meditative interplay between völva prophecy and Norse mythology. The subtle ways divine forces, human choice, and destiny weave together in sagas and memory. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, perfect for late-night contemplation. In Norse belief, fate was omnipresent, embodied by the Norns who weave the destinies of gods and men alike. The völva acted as an interpreter, translating these cosmic threads into human language. Her authority wasn't in changing fate, but in observing, interpreting, and gently guiding humans to act wisely, or at least with measured caution. Calm, pervasive, hypnotic. Take, for example, the sagas in which a völva foretells the rise of a hero or the fall of a kingdom. The prophecy often describes events in broad poetic strokes. The waves will claim a path not yet seen, or shadows linger where light prevails. Listeners are left to interpret specifics, and often misinterpretation adds irony. Yet the core of the prophecy, the inevitability of unfolding events, remains intact. The sagas record it with measured rhythm, gentle pacing, and reflective tone. Divine influence is also subtle. Odin, the god of wisdom, war, and fate, often communicates indirectly through the völva. He grants insight into runes, stars, and the movements of destiny. The völva does not claim to alter fate dramatically. Instead, she conveys his wisdom calmly, allowing humans to adjust their behavior with foresight and subtle caution. Sleepy, hypnotic, slightly ironic, and always reflective. Consider the interplay of human choice and fate. A völva might warn a king, "The bridge you cross may shift beneath your feet," meaning both a literal and metaphorical crossing. The king may delay, adjust, or ignore her advice. The saga records the outcome without dramatic flair. Sometimes minor setbacks occur. Sometimes smooth passage ensues. Either way, the prophecy emphasizes reflection, awareness, and consequence. Calm, instructive, enduring. In legendary sagas, these patterns are pervasive. The völva mediates between gods and mortals, offering insights that shape decisions subtly over time. Her prophecies often combine practical advice, timing, alliances, preparation, with poetic interpretation of divine will.
Warriors, kings, and communities learn to anticipate outcomes, consider nuance, and respect forces larger than themselves. Hypnotic rhythm, reflective pacing, gentle instruction. Irony appears again in subtle forms. Misinterpretations of her cryptic phrasing lead to consequences exactly predicted, yet often unrecognized until later. A king hears "the wolf waits in the shadows" and imagines a literal wolf. Decades later, political betrayal fulfills the prophecy. Calm irony, slowly unfolding, softly instructive, deeply hypnotic. Her role in myth also preserved cultural memory. Völvas ensured that divine narratives, heroic deeds, and moral lessons were embedded in collective consciousness. The sagas, as quiet reflections of their stories, carry her rhythm: measured narration, subtle commentary, gentle moral undertones. Sleepy storytelling intertwined with cultural preservation. Timing remains a central motif. The sagas frequently describe a minor action delayed or hastened according to völva advice. Small adjustments can ripple across decades, influencing dynasties, battles, and settlements. The sagas note these moments without fanfare. Heeding her counsel, the outcome unfolded with less conflict. Subtle, hypnotic, reflective, and quietly powerful. Finally, the lasting impression is of measured inevitability. Fate unfolds, divine forces operate, and humans act, all under the gentle, observing presence of the völva. Her calm voice, rhythmic chant, and cryptic wisdom ensure that choices are tempered, reflection is encouraged, and stories maintain their hypnotic, enduring cadence. Sleepy, subtle, ironic, and timeless. So tonight, as we drift through mythic landscapes and cosmic threads, imagine the völva seated quietly, staff in hand, observing gods and mortals alike. Her voice murmurs prophecy, her insight shapes choice, and her calm authority persists across time. The slow rhythm of fate, divine influence, and reflective human action continues to unfold, hypnotic, gentle, and inevitable.
Intergenerational influence and the quiet shaping of Viking culture. All right, friends. Tonight we float gently into the long-term, intergenerational impact of völva prophecy. The way her subtle guidance, calm authority, and hypnotic rhythm shaped Viking culture across decades, influencing behavior, values, and social memory. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, the perfect tone for late-night listening. The völva's influence was rarely immediate or dramatic. Instead, it unfolded gradually across families, communities, and generations. Her words were remembered, repeated, and interpreted long after she left a hall or village. A prophecy about a child's future, a warning about a political alliance, or advice for harvest timing could persist in collective memory, subtly guiding choices decades later. Calm authority, enduring influence, and hypnotic repetition. Consider a family whose ancestor consulted a völva before embarking on a minor raid. The saga records her advice gently. Fortune favors careful hands, but arrogance invites delay. The raid succeeds, yet the family interprets the prophecy differently over time. Children grow up hearing the story. Grandparents repeat the warning in lullabies, and the lesson is internalized, not as dramatic spectacle, but as a quiet, guiding rhythm shaping character and decision-making. Subtle, reflective, enduring. Völvas also contributed to social cohesion. By reinforcing ethical behavior, careful planning, and foresight, their advice reduced impulsivity and encouraged measured action. Communities internalize these lessons slowly, through repeated storytelling, ritual, and the collective memory of minor consequences observed over time. Sleepy, hypnotic influence, subtly stabilizing culture. One particularly illustrative example comes from sagas describing long feuds. A völva's warning might note, "Grudges linger longer than swords." Families who remembered this counsel delayed revenge, negotiated subtly, or sought compromise. The immediate outcome might not be spectacular, but decades later, the sagas highlight calmer resolution, reduced violence, and continuity of social structures. Calm, understated, yet profoundly effective. Even small domestic rituals retained echoes of her presence. Seasonal ceremonies, offerings to ancestors, and attention to omens persisted long after her physical presence. Communities internalized habits of observation, reflection, and cautious decision-making. The völva's rhythm, slow, deliberate, hypnotic, permeated daily life, subtly shaping social norms, sleep-inducing, reflective, subtly powerful. Another recurring motif is the cumulative effect of repeated advice. Minor instructions on farming, navigation, or diplomacy, when internalized and repeated across generations, shaped outcomes more reliably than dramatic action ever could. The sagas note this quietly. Thus, by careful attention to counsel, the village prospered. Hypnotic, enduring, subtly ironic, her influence more profound in its quiet persistence than any loud display of power. The psychological impact is also notable. Knowing a seeress had observed, interpreted, and advised previously instilled mindfulness in leaders and families alike. Decisions were tempered by historical reflection, guided by caution, and colored by subtle irony, the kind only a long memory can appreciate. Sleepy authority shaping thought across generations. Even in myth, her influence endures. Stories of völvas, their chants and subtle guidance persisted, blending legend and history. They reinforced cultural values, patience, reflection, humility, and awareness of consequence. The sagas carry her hypnotic rhythm, embedding lessons gently, always slightly ironic, always enduring. And of course, the irony remains. Human misinterpretation, selective attention, and delayed response often caused prophecy to unfold in ways the völva anticipated, but humans rarely noticed until later. The saga reports this with calm, almost meditative cadence, as was foreseen, though only understood long after. Quiet, reflective, hypnotic, slightly ironic, the perfect legacy. So tonight, as we drift into the lingering echoes of Viking culture, imagine the völva's voice still present in quiet halls, whispered in stories, remembered in rituals, subtly shaping behavior and thought. Her calm authority threads across decades, guiding families, communities, and leaders with hypnotic rhythm, soft irony, and enduring insight. Sleep, friends, to the gentle sway of her timeless influence.
Fate, human agency, and the hypnotic rhythm of prophecy in Viking society. All right, friends, tonight we settle into the most contemplative corner of our exploration, the subtle hypnotic interplay between fate, human choice, and the quiet rhythm of prophecy in Viking society. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, the perfect tone to drift toward the deeper truths of history. In Norse thought, fate is omnipresent, woven by the Norns and observed by the gods. The völva acts as interpreter, translating cosmic threads into human understanding. Her role is never to impose, but to illuminate possibilities, guide reflection, and quietly shape behavior. Calm, measured, hypnotic influence, soft as the evening tide, persistent as the fjord's mist. Human agency in this context is paradoxically amplified by her guidance.
Leaders, warriors, and villagers may act freely, but the völva's presence encourages reflection, foresight, and subtle prudence. Her cryptic phrasing allows flexibility in interpretation, fostering mindfulness and awareness, while still fate, human agency, and the hypnotic rhythm of prophecy. All right, friends, tonight we settled into the most contemplative corner of our exploration, the subtle, hypnotic interplay between fate, human choice, and the quiet rhythm of prophecy in Viking society. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, the perfect tone to drift toward the deeper truths of history. In Norse thought, fate is omnipresent, woven by the Norns and observed by the gods. The völva acts as interpreter, translating cosmic threads into human understanding. Her role is never to impose, but to illuminate possibilities, guide reflection, and quietly shape behavior. Calm, measured, hypnotic influence, soft as the evening tide, persistent as the fjord's mist. Human agency in this context is paradoxically amplified by her guidance. Leaders, warriors, and villagers may act freely, but the völva's presence encourages reflection, foresight, and subtle prudence. Her cryptic phrasing allows flexibility in interpretation, fostering mindfulness and awareness, while still leaving room for mistakes, missteps, and the slow unfolding of consequence. Sleepily, reflective, subtly ironic. Consider how sagas emphasize small, deliberate choices. A warning about tides, a caution regarding a political alliance, or advice on the timing of planting crops. Each subtly influences outcomes over years, even decades. Her counsel is never dramatic, it's rhythmic, hypnotic, almost meditative. Listeners internalize patterns, repeat them, and through quiet attention align their decisions with the broader currents of fate. Sleepy, reflective, subtly ironic. Consider how sagas emphasize small, deliberate choices. A warning about tides, a caution regarding a political alliance, or advice on the timing of planting crops. Each subtly influences outcomes over years, even decades. Her counsel is never dramatic, it's rhythmic, hypnotic, almost meditative. Listeners internalize patterns, repeat them, and through quiet attention align their decisions with the broader currents of fate. Sleepy, reflective, subtly ironic. Even emotional regulation is part of her influence. The calm cadence of her chant, the deliberate pacing of her narrative, and the measured tone of her guidance subtly shape moods and responses. Warriors pause before acting rashly. Kings consider nuance in governance. Families reflect on consequences before disputes escalate. The völva's power is psychological as well as social, weaving quiet authority into the fabric of everyday life. Sleep-inducing, reflective, gently persuasive. And here's the enduring philosophical insight. Prophecy is not about controlling outcomes, but about framing perspective. It teaches humans to anticipate, observe, reflect, and act with care, while acknowledging the inevitability of fate. The völva never dictates, she orchestrates awareness, subtly nudging behavior across time. Calm, hypnotic, and endlessly instructive. Over generations, her rhythm persists,
Communities remember her insights, replicate her methods in ritual and storytelling, and internalize her cautionary wisdom. This persistence creates a hypnotic cadence in Viking culture. Observation, reflection, measured action, subtle irony. Sleepy yet compelling, gentle yet enduring. Finally, her legacy reminds us that influence need not roar. Power can whisper, guidance can be quiet, and lessons can unfold slowly across decades. The völva's subtle authority threads through sagas, culture, and memory, shaping the rhythm of society, the reflection of individuals, and the quiet unfolding of fate itself. Hypnotic, reflective, and gently ironic, an enduring pattern, soft as twilight, persistent as the tide. So tonight, as we drift toward the final thoughts of this journey, imagine the völva's quiet presence still shaping choice, memory, and understanding. Her voice, soft and deliberate, echoes in halls, fields, and minds across time. The rhythm of prophecy continues to weave between fate and human agency, gentle, subtle, and hypnotic, an eternal lullaby of history.
Closing reflections on the völva's enduring presence. All right, friends, tonight we ease into the final thoughts, reflecting on the life, influence, and quiet hypnotic legacy of the völva in Viking history. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, perfect for winding down our journey. The völva's power was never dramatic in the way modern stories might imagine. She did not command armies with a shout or dictate the tides. Instead, her authority flowed quietly, subtly, like mist curling through fjords. Through careful observation, ritual, prophecy, and calm guidance, she shaped decisions, behavior, and memory, leaving traces of influence that persisted for generations. Sleep-inducing, reflective, enduring. Her role encompassed both the mundane and the extraordinary. She advised kings on alliances and campaigns, offered families guidance on marriages and harvests, and interpreted the movement of stars, weather, and omens with gentle authority. The sagas preserve her rhythm, deliberate pacing, reflective commentary, and soft irony, emphasizing subtlety over spectacle. Calm influence, quietly woven into the fabric of everyday life. Even when her prophecies were misinterpreted, the outcome often unfolded in alignment with her insight. A minor misunderstanding, a delayed response, or human pride created situations that revealed her foresight in retrospect. The sagas note these events almost meditatively. A quiet sigh, a reflective pause, a gentle acknowledgement of inevitability. Hypnotic, subtle, instructive. Her influence extended psychologically and socially. Leaders paused to reflect, communities internalized patterns of cautious decision-making, and ordinary people adjusted their behavior in subtle deference to her presence. Her calm authority shaped thought, tempered emotion, and guided action without ever needing dramatic enforcement. Sleepy, enduring, quietly powerful. Culturally, she became both a character and a method. Rituals, chants, storytelling, and myth all carried echoes of her guidance. Through repetition and memory, her insights persisted across decades, subtly shaping values, etiquette, and behavior. Generations internalized her lessons without spectacle, embedding wisdom in the slow rhythm of life itself. Hypnotic, reflective, slightly ironic, yet deeply enduring. Even in the mythic realm, her presence is profound. She mediates between gods and mortals, translates the threads of fate woven by the Norns, and shapes human understanding of destiny. Prophecy is not a tool of control, but a rhythm of insight, a quiet instruction to observe, reflect, and act thoughtfully within the inevitable flow of life. Calm, soft, eternal. The sagas emphasize that her legacy is both human and divine, practical and poetic. Advice on tides, alliances, and timing blends seamlessly with metaphor, subtle irony, and moral reflection. The listener absorbs it not as a dramatic spectacle, but as a slow, meditative guide to navigating life and fate. Sleepy, hypnotic, endlessly instructive. So tonight, as we drift to the final edges of our story, imagine a völva seated quietly, staff in hand, observing, murmuring, and guiding. Her voice carries across generations, through sagas, through rituals, and through memory, leaving soft, enduring impressions on minds, communities, and culture. Calm, reflective, and hypnotic, the völva's presence is timeless, shaping history in the slow, gentle rhythm of insight, patience, and inevitability. Sleep, friends, to the echo of her calm, hypnotic authority, the timeless lullaby of prophecy, culture, and reflection.
Epilogue, the timeless whisper of the völva. All right, friends, tonight we arrive at the final reflections on the völva, the slow, persistent, hypnotic presence that shaped Viking life, myth, and memory. Sleepy, reflective, slightly ironic, the perfect tone to close our long journey. Through the sagas, folklore, and ritual, the völva leaves an enduring impression. Her influence was subtle, measured, and patient. She did not dictate outcomes with dramatic flair. Instead, she shaped decisions, guided reflections, and threaded her wisdom into the very rhythm of life. Calm, hypnotic authority, gently persuasive, quietly enduring. Her prophecies remind us that fate and human agency are intertwined. She interprets the threads woven by the Norns, translating cosmic patterns into guidance humans can understand. Leaders, warriors, and communities internalize her advice slowly, making choices with reflection, foresight, and subtle awareness. Sleepy, meditative influence, shaping both immediate action and long-term culture. The sagas highlight irony gently, never harshly. Misinterpretation, pride, or delay often fulfills prophecy in unexpected ways. Yet these outcomes reinforce subtle lessons, patience, humility, and the quiet consequences of choice. Her wisdom is not flashy. It whispers across generations, carrying insight wrapped in reflective, hypnotic cadence. Even beyond life, the völva persists. Rituals, chants, family lore, and storytelling preserve her guidance. Communities absorb patterns of careful observation, social cohesion, and mindful decision-making. Her influence, soft as a murmur, threads through generations, gently shaping memory, culture, and understanding. Hypnotic, reflective, enduring. And there is beauty in this subtlety. The völva demonstrates that authority does not require spectacle. Influence does not demand force. Guidance can ripple softly, persist through memory, and shape human life through quiet, persistent presence. Calm, gentle, slightly ironic, the echo of her voice is timeless. So tonight, as our long journey through Viking history, prophecy, and culture draws to a close, picture the völva seated quietly in a smoky hall, staff in hand, murmuring softly. Her words linger, her rhythm endures, and her subtle authority threads through generations, shaping fate, memory, and reflection. Sleepy, hypnotic, gentle, and inevitable. Let the quiet rhythm of her presence guide your thoughts. Imagine the fjords shrouded in mist, the torches burning low, and the soft cadence of prophecy echoing across time. The völva's whisper remains, patient, reflective, subtle, and enduring. Good night, friends. Let the soft echo of her insight carry you into restful contemplation and drift with the gentle, hypnotic rhythm of history itself.
Anecdotes, minor sagas, and subtle lessons. All right, friends, tonight we float through smaller, quieter stories, minor sagas and anecdotes that capture the gentle, enduring influence of the völva. Sleepy, reflective, and slightly ironic, the perfect way to extend our journey without drama, letting the mind drift through history. One tale tells of a minor chieftain named Eirik, whose ambitions were modest but persistent. Before a small coastal raid, he consulted a völva who murmured, "The sea holds both gift and delay. Patience will bring what haste cannot." Eirik, eager as most humans are, waited only a day before setting sail. The winds shifted, slowing his journey, yet eventually his fleet returned safely with a modest gain. The saga records this almost meditatively. Thus her counsel held true, though the measure of delay was subtle. Sleepy, ironic, and quietly instructive, a pattern repeated across many minor sagas. Another story involves a young woman named Sigrid, renowned in her village for cleverness and wit. A völva advised her, "Words carried lightly can build or break. Weigh them softly before release." Sigrid heeded the advice, moderating her speech in negotiations over land and marriage. The result? Fewer quarrels, smoother alliances, and a life remembered for quiet diplomacy rather than spectacle. Subtle guidance, gentle consequence, reflective morality, classic völva influence. Sometimes the sagas highlight communal lessons. A village once suffered poor harvests despite careful work. A visiting völva suggested minor adjustments, planting slightly later, observing patterns of rainfall, and offering quiet ritual to honor ancestral memory. Over the next few seasons, yields improved, not magically, but through attentive observation, subtle adaptation, and reflection. The saga notes this softly. Those who listened found fortune in small, measured ways, calm, instructive, hypnotic. Even humor appears, though gently ironic. One story recounts a boastful warrior who mocked a völva's advice. Fools follow whispers, not strength. He launched a raid too early, misjudged the tide, and returned with wet armor and soggy morale. The saga comments without mockery, just observation. Perhaps whispers carry more than he knew. Subtle irony, soft humor, hypnotic rhythm. Classic völva storytelling. And then there are intergenerational tales. A völva might advise a father, whose child then recalls her words decades later in an entirely different context. Perhaps a warning about patience, or a metaphor about shadows and light, resurfaces in unexpected ways. A marriage negotiation, a political dispute, or even a personal challenge. The sagas note these echoes in measured tones. Her counsel returned in quiet thought, guiding a hand long after her voice was heard. Sleep-inducing, reflective, gently instructive.
These minor sagas emphasize subtlety over spectacle, observation over action, and reflection over impulse. The völva's influence is never about immediate triumph or dramatic intervention. Instead, it is measured, hypnotic, and enduring. Choices are guided, consequences unfold gradually, and the human mind internalizes lessons over time. Quiet, soft, reflective, the hallmark of her presence. Finally, the cumulative effect of these stories creates a rhythm in Viking culture. Anticipation, reflection, cautious action, subtle irony, and long-term memory. Each anecdote contributes to a larger tapestry of behavior, values, and cultural continuity. Her whisper persists, threading through generations, shaping the rhythm of everyday life in subtle, enduring ways. Sleep, friends, to the soft echo of her wisdom, subtle, enduring, and inevitable.
Quiet lessons, patience, and subtle irony. All right, friends, tonight we meander further into minor sagas and anecdotes, focusing on patience, subtle foresight, and the quiet irony that defines völva guidance. Sleepy, reflective, slightly ironic, the perfect rhythm for our slow historical journey. One story recounts a fisherman named Leif, known for impatience and eagerness to prove skill. Before a long voyage, a völva advised, "Wait until the morning fog lifts, for clarity is not found in haste." Leif, restless as most humans are, set out immediately. The fog slowed his navigation. Some nets were lost, and minor frustrations accumulated. Yet he survived and returned home with his catch intact. The saga comments quietly, "Haste delayed, but did not destroy. Wisdom waits for those who listen." Calm, subtle, slightly ironic, the hypnotic rhythm of history unfolding softly. Another tale involves a minor noblewoman, Astrid, managing land and tenants. A völva whispered, "Listen to the voices you cannot see. The quiet often speaks louder than the loud." Astrid, following the advice, observed minor patterns in behavior, agricultural cycles, and community interaction. Over years, she maintained harmony and prosperity, unnoticed by the more dramatic chronicles of kings and warriors. Subtle guidance, quietly effective, reflective, and sleep-inducing. Even conflicts offer gentle moral lessons. A feud erupted between two neighboring villages over grazing land. A völva intervened not with force, but with measured observation. The river divides, but patience unites. Both parties paused, listened, and mediated slowly, preventing violence. The saga reports this without fanfare. Calm reflection saved what impulsive action might have lost. Soft irony, hypnotic cadence, enduring lesson. Sometimes the völva's advice is humorous yet instructive. One saga tells of a boastful young warrior who laughed at her cryptic warning. "Even the strongest tree bends in wind." Later, a storm toppled several tents and minor supplies, leaving him mildly embarrassed, but otherwise unharmed. The saga notes, "Perhaps trees and whispers know more than men often admit." Gentle humor, soft irony, reflective pacing, a hallmark of völva storytelling. Intergenerational influence appears again. Advice given to parents echoes in children's decisions decades later. A father hears, "Measure words as carefully as swords," and passes this to his son. The son navigates minor political disputes with calm attention, earning subtle respect. These echoes appear repeatedly across sagas: patience, caution, reflection, subtly shaping human behavior over time. Sleep-inducing, gentle, and instructive. Even natural events are woven into the lessons. A völva might interpret tides, winds, or animal behavior, not for immediate spectacle, but for subtle guidance. A delay in planting, a cautious voyage, or careful observation of seasonal patterns ensures better outcomes. The sagas report it with soft cadence. Thus, the quiet rhythm of nature aligned with her insight, guiding those who paused. Hypnotic, reflective, enduring, slightly ironic. Finally, these minor sagas collectively illustrate the enduring power of subtle influence. The völva's authority is calm, measured, and psychological. Lessons are absorbed gradually. Outcomes unfold with reflective patience. Human misinterpretation and irony create gentle, instructive patterns, never dramatic, always hypnotic. Sleepy storytelling at its most meditative and instructive. So, tonight, as we drift through these quiet anecdotes, imagine the ripple of each small story across generations. Patience, foresight, reflection, and subtle irony quietly shape choices, culture, and memory. And perhaps as your mind drifts with the rhythm of these tales, you may feel the völva's gentle, hypnotic presence, guiding thought, reflection, and imagination. Sleep, friends, to the soft cadence of history and the enduring whisper of her wisdom.
Culmination of lessons and the quiet rhythm of influence. All right, friends, tonight we linger in the last gentle anecdotes and reflections, observing how the völva's guidance, subtle irony, and hypnotic rhythm shaped the small and large moments of Viking life. Sleepy, reflective, slightly ironic, the perfect cadence as we approach the close of this long journey. One minor saga recounts a shipwright named Thorvald, meticulous but impatient. Before a stormy voyage, a völva advised, "Measure timber as you would measure time. Haste will weaken both." Thorvald, initially skeptical, adjusted only a few key planks. The ship held better than most, though minor leaks delayed progress. The saga records calmly, "Her counsel softened error and preserved life, though not without gentle reminder of human folly." Soft irony, subtle reflection, hypnotic rhythm. Another story involves a farmer, Hakon, whose crops had suffered from inconsistent rains. A völva suggested minor changes to planting schedules and attentive observation of seasonal signs. Over years, Hakon's yields improved incrementally, unnoticed by anyone outside the village. The saga notes quietly, "Small attention to quiet counsel brings steady fortune." Reflective, instructive, sleep-inducing. Even disputes among neighbors reveal subtle lessons. A disagreement over fishing rights was mediated when a völva murmured, "The current flows both ways, respect its path." Both parties hesitated, reflected, and eventually adjusted agreements without escalation. The saga observes, peace arrived gently, as prophecy suggested. Calm, measured, slightly ironic, hypnotic. Sometimes the völva's wisdom plays out humorously. A boastful young warrior ignored a warning. The raven watches where the sword does not. Later, a minor misstep in battle embarrassed him, though no serious harm occurred. The saga comments dryly, even the bird foretold small lessons, often unnoticed until later. Subtle humor, hypnotic cadence, reflective guidance, classic völva style. Intergenerational echoes appear once more. Advice given in one era often shapes behavior decades later. A parent might recall, "Measure words as carefully as your deeds," and that lesson informs negotiation, marriage arrangements, and leadership decisions years later. The ripple effect of her guidance threads quietly through families, subtly shaping social memory. Sleepy, reflective, enduring. Even natural observations, winds, tides, animal behavior, are recorded as quiet guidance. Minor adjustments based on these observations improve outcomes in farming, fishing, and travel. The saga notes softly, those who observed slowly found fortune aligned with foresight. Hypnotic, reflective, slightly ironic, and enduring. Finally, these cumulative anecdotes illustrate the quiet power of subtle influence. The völva's authority is never forceful, always measured. Lessons unfold gradually, with patience and reflection. Human error, misinterpretation, and irony add texture, making outcomes quietly instructive. Her guidance shapes individuals, communities, and culture in slow, enduring ways. Sleep-inducing, hypnotic, reflective. So tonight, as our long journey through Viking history, prophecy, and culture nears its end, imagine the völva seated quietly, observing, murmuring, guiding. Her voice threads across time, shaping choices, reflection, and understanding. The rhythm of prophecy, subtle influence, and quiet irony endures. Sleep, friends, to the gentle cadence of her wisdom, and drift with the soft, hypnotic rhythm of history itself.
The Final Whisper, Timeless Reflections on the Völva. All right, friends. Tonight we arrive at the final reflection, gently closing our long journey through Viking life, prophecy, and the enduring presence of the völva. Sleepy, reflective, slightly ironic, the perfect lullaby to drift into restful contemplation. Throughout her life, the völva's influence was subtle, calm, and hypnotic. She did not command or demand, but guided, observed, and suggested.
Her voice shaped decisions, her presence shaped communities, and her wisdom threaded through generations. Calm authority, reflective insight, and enduring influence, soft as the mist over fjords, persistent as the evening tide. The sagas, minor anecdotes, and folklore capture her rhythm. Cryptic warnings, poetic metaphors, and quiet counsel persist in memory. She teaches patience, careful observation, humility, and reflection. Even misinterpretations, delays, or human pride only serve to reinforce subtle lessons. Sleepy, hypnotic, instructive, soft echoes of wisdom carried across centuries. Her influence threads through human emotion, psychology, and culture. Leaders pause before action. Communities internalize patterns of foresight, and families absorb intergenerational guidance. Small decisions align with subtle prophecy. Minor adjustments prevent larger setbacks, and gentle lessons ripple quietly through history. Hypnotic, reflective, slightly ironic, enduring. Even in myth, her presence resonates. The völva mediates between gods and mortals, interprets fate woven by the Norns, and reminds humans of the slow interplay between destiny and choice. Her guidance is never dramatic. It is rhythmic, calm, and quietly instructive. Every story, anecdote, and saga preserves the hypnotic cadence of her wisdom. Sleep-inducing, meditative, timeless. The quiet irony of her work is enduring. Human error, misinterpretation, and delay unfold prophecy in subtle ways, often unnoticed until reflection. Her whispers shape memory and culture not through spectacle, but through calm observation, gentle instruction, and subtle guidance. Lessons persist because they are absorbed slowly, meditated upon, and repeated across generations. Reflective, soft, hypnotic. And so tonight, imagine her seated quietly, staff in hand, observing, murmuring, guiding. Her voice threads through time, shaping thought, behavior, and memory. The fjords, halls, and villages echo softly with her insight. The rhythm of prophecy, the cadence of reflection, and the gentle sway of human choice all converge in her enduring presence. Calm, subtle, hypnotic, timeless. As you drift to sleep, let the soft cadence of her guidance carry you. Consider the quiet lessons of patience, foresight, subtle irony, and gentle authority. Imagine the ripple of influence across generations, shaping culture, memory, and understanding. Sleep, friends, to the slow, enduring rhythm of the völva's whisper. Soft, reflective, and inevitable. Good night.